In this lesson, we talk about AOVs in Arnold for Cinema 4D. We continue discussing this topic for the next few lessons. AOVs, or arbitrary output variables or render passes, allow you to break down your beauty render into the parts that made that beauty pass. So you can render out different passes like direct and indirect diffuse, direct and indirect specular, transmission, subsurface scattering, and import them in your compositing app and combine those passes back together. Also, you can have access to some utility or layer system AOVs like motion vector, normal, z-depth, ray count, and use them in your compositing app to add different effects. Let's run the IPR quickly. This scene is fairly randomly put together to give us most of the AOVs we need to be familiar with. We have subsurface scattering, transmission, specular reflections, motion blur, emission, some fire and smoke, and so on. Actually, to see the fire, select this Arnold volume and load this fire.vdb file from the OpenVDB folder in your project files, or it won't show up in your render as it has an absolute path. Let's open up the render settings and go to the AOVs tab. The only active AOV right now is the beauty, which is the displayed AOV in the IPR. And we can see all the inactive AOVs listed on the left side in a few different categories. The built-in AOVs contain the main AOVs like diffuse, specular, subsurface scattering, transmission, volume, coat, sheen, normal, z-depth, and so on. We have the cryptomatte AOVs, which will be discussed in the next lesson. We discussed shadow matte AOVs in the shadow matte lesson. The standard surface IDs and standard hair IDs were mentioned in the shading section, but we'll take a look at them again in the next lesson. And finally, we have the toon shader AOVs for highlight and the rim light. In this lesson, we specifically talk about the built-in AOVs. So I'm gonna stop the IPR and select all the inactive built-in AOVs and drag them to the active list. Now let's render our scene to the picture viewer. And by the way, this scene uses the built-in color manager. Now in the layer tab, we can change the mode to single pass and take a look at the AOVs. We have diffuse AOV, which is the base color or diffuse contribution. Diffuse albedo is the base color or diffuse color without lighting or shadowing. Diffuse direct gives us diffuse direct lighting. And diffuse indirect is the diffuse indirect lighting. Specular AOV gives us specular reflections. Specular albedo is the pure specular color without lighting or shadowing. Specular direct is the direct specular reflections from the light sources. And specular indirect is the indirect specular reflections. Transmission is transmission or refraction AOV. You can call this specular transmission as well. Transmission albedo is the transmission color without lighting or shadowing. SSS is the subsurface scattering AOV. SSS albedo gives us the pure SSS color without lighting or shadowing. SSS direct is the direct SSS AOV, and SSS indirect is the indirect subsurface scattering AOV. Coat is the coat reflection on top of the specular layer. Coat albedo is the pure coat color without lighting or shadowing. Coat direct is the coat reflections from direct lighting, and coat indirect is the coat reflections from the indirect lighting. Direct AOV is a very important pass that contains all direct lighting contribution from all surfaces and volumes, including base color, specular, coat, SSS, and so on. Indirect AOV is the indirect light contribution from all the surfaces and volumes, including base color, specular, coat, SSS, sheen, and so on. Emission AOV is the lights and emissive objects directly visible from the camera view. Sheen is the sheen layer contribution of the shaders. Sheen albedo is the pure sheen color without lighting or shadowing. Sheen direct is the contribution of the direct lighting to the sheen component of the shaders. And sheen indirect is the contribution of the indirect lighting to the sheen components. Volume is a beauty AOV that contains volumes. We can see our smoke here. Volume albedo is the volume color without lighting or shadowing. Volume direct is the direct scattering in volumes, and volume indirect is the indirect scattering in volumes. Volume opacity is the RGB AOV with the full 3-channel opacity for the volumes. We will be obviously talking about Arnold volumes in its own lesson, probably in the next section. Now let's take a look at some of the more important utility AOVs. Alpha AOV is the alpha pass, and as we don't have any background and the backdrop object covers the entire camera view, this pass is white here. Motion vector AOV is a 2D vector representing the motion in scene space of the shading point during the given time interval, and that's basically the shutter start and the shutter end of the camera. N is the normal at the shading point. P is the position in world space coordinates of the shading point. Z AOV contains the depth information of the scene. As this pass is not normalized, i.e. the values are not 0 to 1, we need to go to the filter tab and decrease the exposure to something like -3. And now we can see the depth information of our scene, and this pass can be used to add fake depth of field in post and a few other effects as well. Let's disable filter for now. And shadow matte is the unoccluded direct lighting minus the direct light used to catch shadows from lighting within the scene. So these were some of the more important AOVs. We will talk about custom AOVs, global AOV shaders, crypto matte, object mask, AOV right shaders, and so on in the next lesson. And in one of the future videos in this section, we'll learn how to composite them in Fusion and probably After Effects as well. For now, let's get back to the AOV tab in the render setting and take a look around to see what else do we have here. So up here you get this drivers list which shows all the drivers in the scene. We can also add a new driver from here. Let's add a JPEG driver, for example. You can name it as well. Now I can select the JPEG driver specifically. Let's delete all the AOVs for this driver except for the beauty, Z, and normal. Now this driver only contains these 3 AOVs, and our display driver still contains all the AOVs. Also, you can see that JPEG driver is added to the object manager. If we select a specific AOV from the active list, like the beauty pass, we can enable real-time optics denoising for this particular AOV. We talk about optics denoising later on in its own lesson. And if we had a few light groups, we could assign the beauty pass to that particular light group. Again, we talk about AOV light groups in a future lesson, but we discussed it briefly in the light manager lesson in the lighting section of the course. This light manager button opens up the light manager window directly from here without having to open it up from the Arnold menu. We can save, load, and delete our active AOVs as presets using this AOV preset button. And finally, we can add our own custom AOVs. We'll learn more about that in the next lesson. So that is about the basics of Arnold AOVs. We'll learn more about AOVs in the next lesson. See you there.